listening to the Agent Survival Guide podcast, a podcast for today's insurance agents. Informing, educating, empowering, improving the way you do business in an industry that's anything but static. In today's episode, we explain CMS rules for sharing beneficiary data. Learn how to stay compliant in guidelines for sharing personal beneficiary data with other TPMOs, written by Isabel Vitale. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, has continued to refine and expand rules for third-party marketing organizations, or TPMOs for short. And for a bit of context, these rules were first implemented as part of their 2023 Medicare Advantage and Part D final rule. With their final rule for contract year 2025, CMS now requires TPMOs to obtain prior express written consent from the beneficiary before sharing their personal data. Let's get into the details agents need to know. First, the definition of what is considered a TPMO in Medicare. CMS defines TPMOs as, quote, organizations that are compensated to perform lead generation, marketing, sales, and enrollment-related functions as a part of the chain of enrollment, end quote. According to their terminology, CMS considers all lead generation organizations, agencies, and independent insurance agents and brokers to be TPMOs. Therefore, field marketing organizations, insurance agents, and brokers must adhere to all of the CMS TPMO rules and guidelines. By that definition, we are required to follow CMS rules around sharing personal beneficiary data. That includes some or all of the following information: name, address, phone number, other contact information, and any other information given by the beneficiary for the purpose of finding an appropriate Medicare Advantage or Part D plan. When in doubt as to whether data is considered personal, err on the side of caution and assume that it is. The new CMS rules require all TPMOs to obtain prior expressed written consent from the beneficiary before sharing their personal data. Couple of things to keep in mind here. The consent must involve a clear and easily visible disclosure listing each TPMO receiving the data. Additionally, the beneficiary must have the option to consent or reject data sharing with each individually specified TPMO. Beneficiaries must opt in. Affirmative action is required for consent, with the default being no sharing, unless the beneficiary actively agrees to share data with each TPMO. TPMOs may obtain consent through various written forms other than a signed hard copy, including a website interface, email, or text message. Couple more clarifications that I'd like to get into here. First, let's talk about why CMS imposed this rule. CMS wants to curtail activities by bad actors in the industry, stating that, quote, some TPMOs have been selling and reselling personal beneficiary data, which can undermine existing rules that prohibit cold calling people enrolled in Medicare and result in other aggressive marketing tactics for Medicare Advantage and Part D plans. Individuals may be unaware that by placing a call or clicking on a generic-looking web link, they are unwittingly agreeing and providing consent for their personal beneficiary data to be collected and sold to other entities for future marketing activities, end quote. Now, depending on how you're interacting with a beneficiary, that could create an exception to the rule, but it would only apply in specific circumstances. CMS does state that prior express written consent may not be necessary in situations of real-time assistance and phone transfers. One example, a beneficiary may call a TPMO seeking to get information about Medicare and that TPMO.
To assist the beneficiary, the TPMO may be able to transfer or connect that beneficiary to another TPMO, such as an agent, during the call to provide real-time assistance. A verbal agreement from the beneficiary during the live call is sufficient. We recommend that agents record any permission granted, which you are likely doing anyway because of call recording requirements, or obtain emailed consent. If the agent cannot assist the beneficiary through a live transfer, then that agent will need to obtain written consent before sharing the data with another agent for a callback. CMS also clarifies that, quote, the definition of TPMO does not apply to MA organizations or Part D sponsors, and therefore TPMOs may share personal beneficiary data with those entities without acquiring direct consent from the beneficiary under this rule, end quote. However, any agent or entity sharing personal beneficiary data would still need to ensure they are complying with HIPAA privacy rules. I also want to mention here, while we're on the subject of phone conversations, that if you are manually dialing phone numbers, even if you're adhering to the Telephone Consumer Protection Act regulations, you still must obtain prior express written consent. Agents should get permission for each TPMO you're sharing data with. A beneficiary must have the option to consent or reject data sharing with each individual TPMO. The disclaimer must specify each TPMO by name and get permission for each in a one-to-one consent structure. That means no sharing personal beneficiary data with another independent agent without consent. An independent agent cannot share personal beneficiary data with another independent agent, even if both are affiliated with the same FMO, unless the independent agent obtains prior express written consent before sharing. That means the first independent agent must obtain prior express consent from the beneficiary to share their personal data with a specifically identified independent agent. A generic mention of another agent in the disclaimer is not sufficient. And even if you are downlines of the same upstream entity, you'll need to get prior express written consent. You might both be affiliated with a shared parent company, have contracts for downstream services, or be independent agents under the same FMO, but sharing the beneficiary's data still requires prior express written consent. Now, this has led us to get some questions about an agent's ability to buy leads from their FMO or other organizations. That depends on the FMO or lead generator organization and the type of lead. If the FMO or other organization has implemented the proper steps to obtain prior express written consent for Medicare Advantage and Part D leads to sell the lead to you specifically, then yes, you will still be able to buy compliant leads. The final rule only applies to buying Medicare Advantage and Part D leads. The same rules do not apply to other kinds of leads, like Medicare Supplement and Final Expense. As far as how long the consent is good for, like the Medicare Permission to Contact form, the prior express written consent is valid for 12 months or until a client declines further contact. After that, the TPMO would need to obtain renewed consent. And then, similarly to scope of appointment records, prior express written consent records should be kept for 10 additional years after the selling year. If you're looking for a model disclaimer to use as you create your own, CMS points to the Federal Trade Commission for examples of what they consider clear and conspicuous disclaimers regarding obtaining consent. We'll be linking to the FTC.com disclosures PDF in our episode notes. They've got all the details on disclaimers, complete with examples. We will also have the link to the clear and conspicuous definition in the Federal Register as well. 2025 is a year of change for Medicare, but agents can proceed compliantly with lead sharing by following these guidelines and obtaining prior express written consent. If you have any questions, please reach out to our compliance team. Their email will be linked in the episode notes. And for a single-page document of these guidelines, you can download sharing of personal beneficiary data with other TPMOs in our episode notes. Thanks for listening to this installment of our Agent Survival Guide podcast. We will see you next episode. The Agent Survival Guide podcast is a production of Ritter Insurance Marketing, an Integrity company. This episode was written by Isabel Vitale. Script adaptation by Tina Lamoureux. Recording and production by me, Sarah Ruppel. Podcast design by Urban Rivera. Artwork by Vivian Zhao. Rate and review our show on Apple or Spotify.